a really fun toy to play with.
Right, right. Well, back in 1962, we had a series of aerial nuclear testing, high-altitude nuclear testing, and basically off the atolls off Hawaii, thousands of miles off of Hawaii, they were doing this high-altitude nuclear testing. And so when they did this, it had the burst of energy, and EMP was created. It knocked out all the electronics of the testers, which they didn't understand. And what they didn't realize at the time is that at the speed of light, it also knocked out power and other things out in Hawaii, again, because of the line of sight aspect. Now, it wasn't even as bad as it could have been today because it was older technology and tube technology, but all the stuff was destroyed and it had to be replaced. So, again, at the time, this stuff was secret. Now, one of the people who they sent out to take a look at all that was a man named Dr. Bill Graham. Dr. Bill Graham went out there and he learned all about this, and he later ended up becoming the chief science advisor to Ronald Reagan. He also ran NASA, and eventually he became the head of the EMP Commission that we've been talking about. And so, and we have interviews with Dr. Graham on our show, and he's again, obviously, he's been really involved in the things that we're doing, but it's incredible. And so they knew about it, and they did EMP protection and all through the Cold War, and there were all types of incidents. In fact, there were incidents where there were solar storms, including the 1989 storm, where there was a kind of almost a war scare because of that, because they thought, oh well, here we see this this EMP type effect. Is this the Soviet Union? Is this what's going on? And yet, nobody wanted to talk about it because, first of all, they didn't want the Soviets to know about it. And of course, after the Cold War, we learned that sure, they knew all about it. And the United States had a preemptive EMP plan, and Russia had, the Soviet Union had a preemptive EMP plan as the first strike to knock out command control to the extent possible, to make it so that we couldn't move troops or respond, hopefully, although, a lot of the direct command control, was hardwired and EMP protected, but neither side, really knew that.
Before we get too far into it, I also want to mention one thing. You were talking about transformers, and isn't it also true that that electric surge the electromagnetic surge, is actually conducted all the way down between all those transformers by the lines connecting them?
Yeah, the important thing that I think here, and this may be a good time for me to explain those phases of an EMP on the nuclear side, and then I'll explain why it's really the third phase that's common between the nuclear burst and the Great Geomagnetic Storm.
Okay.
So the first two things I'm going to explain are really kind of unique to the nuclear, and then the third one is almost the same between the two. So the first pulse, an E1 pulse, they call it, is a very fast pulse, and it destroys everything right down to small and larger electronics. So we're talking about, this is the kind of thing that would knock out microchips, it would knock out cell phones, it would knock out cars, it would knock, you name it, in that department, it's likely to do damage. Now, it does depend on field strength and things like that, it's probably not worth getting into, but it is important to understand that would damage things that essentially, unless they were in a Faraday cage, which I can explain in a second, or something like that, they're going to get damaged. Just having them unplugged would not protect them. Mm-hmm. Now, then there's an E2 pulse. The E2 pulse is best categorized as being just like lightning. So if you were only dealing with an E2 pulse, then a lot of our current surge protection would probably work for an E2 pulse. But, of course, that a surge protector, a lot of them, first of all, they can get fried by whatever it is. So they might protect your electronics the first time, but if you didn't reset them or get a new one, then the electronics could be damaged by a second strike. Well, first of all, the E1 pulse is likely to take out those surge protectors, and so the E2 pulse would be like not having the surge protector, and thus you'd be susceptible to the lightning-like effect. It could be a multiplier, cause further damage. The third one, which is called the E3, is a long pulse. In my long, long wavelength pulse. We're talking about several meters. And so this is unlikely because it's, to affect small electronics like your cell phone or even like a car, because it gets the way that this thing does the most, but it's very, very strong, very, very powerful, but it gets picked up on long transmission lines, and that's why our power grid and even railroad lines and things like that, cable, become susceptible to this. Now, of course, it doesn't have any effect at all on like fiber optic and stuff like that, because there's no conductive material. But if you think about it, the United States is in a uniquely vulnerable position because we have so many thousands and thousands of miles of these long power lines that really very few other countries even deal with this issue. I mean, certainly, the UK or even like small islands like Hawaii, they're not really going to pick up this type because they're not going to have enough of an antenna to catch this thing. And so when it comes down and it builds up on the power lines, it just wreaks havoc, including going down and melting those large transformers. Mm-hmm. So that's the one that's the same as a solar storm. Now, if you were looking at a solar storm scenario, what could an individual do? Well, first of all, you could just unplug everything. You could, if you knew a solar storm was coming, and oftentimes we do know that a solar storm is coming, then you unplug everything. And that may not help you if the entire grid is down and you can't plug it back in, but at least you know that you could protect your individual stuff. Also, let's take something like generators. A lot of your generators, they're tied into the house, they're tied into the grid, and therefore, if you knew that was coming, you might want to either disconnect it or throw. Obviously, with the advice of electrician, disclaimer. But you disconnecting it might save it from being damaged or destroyed. Even with your house, if you were to go downstairs and flip the main circuit breaker, again, you may be protecting all the wires in your house. If you were to have if you had a generator that you used for the house that wasn't always connected, so it's one of the mobile generators, having it in your garage and unplugged, maybe the difference between having the generator or not having the generator. And when it comes to a solar storm in particular, it may not just be that it happens and the power goes out and then it's safe all of a sudden. So you may want to wait before you plug this thing in, and hoping that you're going to get past the storm, so that you don't go and unintentionally destroy it by reacting prematurely.
Well, before everybody goes out and starts buying generators, and I live outside of Buffalo, where you have to have one, or you're not going to make it through the winter very often. Remember that you have to get gas, let's say gasoline, to run a generator, and that means that gas pump has to suck the gasoline up out of the tank, and that's probably not going to be working.
No, it's absolutely correct. And if you, again, this is where it comes down, where certain individual preparedness or even local preparedness at the town, municipal level can make a big difference. And let me give you a couple examples. So, I live in Western New York too, and we had an October storm in 2006 that came through. They called it a surprise storm. It knocked out power here for an extended period of time, and even there, so you didn't have a credit card. Nobody could swipe a credit card, so you couldn't buy anything if you didn't have cash, or assuming that they would even have their registers open and working. And even if they did, the gas pumps were off, and so you couldn't get the gas unless you drove outside of the affected area. Now, what about getting gas out of the ground? Well, that's not really that easy. I mean, a lot of times that gas is up to 15 feet down, so you're not going to put a hose down there and suck it up with the power in your lungs. But there are things like lift pumps, or you could even use a fuel pump off of a vehicle if you were to rig it to, like, say, a 12-volt battery very carefully under the advice of electrician, disclaimer. And, there are ways that you could do that if you planned ahead. Other things could be, again, having a generator that could be used to power the pump, et cetera. So there are things that you could do to plan, even if it were for an October storm or, the events that we're seeing right now, from the weather down south, that can really make a difference, like even a life and death difference, especially when you look at a municipality's ability to respond, their ability to power their vehicles for police, fire, medical, all these types of things. And it makes a lot of sense to do that. It makes a lot of sense to look at what if, and to not, and by the way, I'm not in any way bashing emergency managers or anyone like that, because they are the heroes of our communities. They work very hard, and they spend a lot of time on their planning. But a lot of times, it's just the nature of our society, the nature of our just-in-time budget-to-budget, minute-to-minute society that we just don't pre-position things as much as we used to. And we are more used to having a cell phone and a credit card to call out and get help that we need when we need it, and not stockpile things because either they're going to go bad or because, anybody who runs a business understands the difference of being able to buy things when you need them versus the cost of overhead of having things in inventory. And so there's a lot of pressure not to keep things around. But it could make a lot of sense. There are other things, for example, that people could do, like having gravity filters, like Berkey filters, where you could, one person, you take a regular Berkey filter, like a Royal Berkey filter, the gravity filter that you can purify, like say 6,000 gallons with this thing, a couple gallons an hour. One person with a house could supply enough water for a neighborhood of say 100 people with clean water. Because what happens with water? Let's take that as an example. Right now, most of the time you've got water towers. Everybody sees those water towers, and everybody knows that, well, a lot of times when the power goes out, my water still works. Well, yes, it does, because before the power went out, electric pumps pumped water up into that tower after it was all, purified, by the way, to begin with, pumped it up into that tower, and it's being gravity-fed, which is what's creating pressure that's pushing it through the pipes. And if you were in an area, for example, in Western New York that was affected by the October storm, or if people are listening down where the current storms are happening, if you're without power for long enough, the water that was pumped up there before the outage goes away. And then what happens are several things. First of all, the water is not coming through as quick, but even before that happens, you experience boiling orders. And you're getting boiling orders because normally there's pressure in those pipes that's forcing water outward, and so you don't have contamination. But when that pressure goes down and all the pipes leak, you get contamination of the water, and they start issuing boiling orders, and that water's not safe to drink. So at least without boiling it or without putting it through a purification system.
Well, and if you're going to boil it, then you've got to talk about what are you going to boil it with, and do you have enough fuel to boil it more than a couple of times or whatever. We're getting close to a break here, Ross. So let me remind everybody that they're listening to Epic Voyages Radio right now, and Ross Howarth with the EMPact America organization. We're talking about electromagnetic pulses, and we're going to take a break here on InceptionRadioNetwork.com for just a few minutes, and when we come back, we'll be looking for your phone calls, and the number, I'm putting it in the chat room on the online show. It's 888-919-2355, and I think when we come back, Ross, let's talk a little more about how to get prepared for it, and talk about your Prepare Hub site and some of those other facts, okay?
That sounds great.
Okay, we'll see you back on the other side of the break.
Okay.
Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Epic Voyages Radio on InceptionRadioNetwork.com. Our guest tonight is Ross Howarth, who is an expert on trying to prepare yourself to deal with the inevitability of an electromagnetic pulse, sorry about that, strike, whether man-made or solar. And on this half of the show, we're going to be talking a little bit more about preparedness and planning. I want to put a link up in the chat room right now. There is a link in one of the EMPact America websites. It's the preparehub.org, to a National Geographic Explorer documentary, a full-length hour documentary without the commercials, that was produced in June of 2010, and it is specifically about life after an EMP, when you live in a technology-saturated culture such as we do. Definitely, it would be a really good, as Ross said earlier, a good primer on this topic. Also, I want to remind you about this book, 1 Second After, by William Forstchen, Forstchen, and it's really an eye-opener about the kinds of things that all of a sudden won't be there for you to rely on anymore if an EMP does happen. Ross, let's talk a little bit about your preparedness planning. There's a section in the book, and I don't want to turn anyone against the book yet, but like I said, it's an eye-opener. It's a small mountain town. There's not that many people there, and they're trying to protect themselves against the refugees coming from Charlotte and Asheville in North Carolina up to the mountains, where everyone knows people in the country have food, so that's where they're all heading. And as it turns out, they don't have a whole lot of food. The grocery store, what's probably more like a stop and go, is emptied out in the first day, and they're looking at rounding up whatever wildlife, squirrels included, possums, and what little cattle there is up in the mountains, and pigs. And then they say, oh, hey, you know what? We've got pets. So many people have pets. We can take the pets and we can use them and put them in the communal store here, and we'll live on our pets for a couple of weeks. That'll get us through. So there's quite a bit of planning that you have to think about if you're going to get yourself and your family ready to go even just a couple of weeks without being able to rely on driving up to the store to pick up milk or water or whatever, pet food. I was talking earlier about insulin for people who have diabetes. Ross, tell us a little bit about your website and the planning instruments.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to step back and just comment on a couple things because, for example, the 1 Second After book, I thought that it was great because you can learn from these mistakes that you see the characters go through. And they're not really so much mistakes. They're probably things that everyone would do, but in hindsight, there are things that they might have done differently. And to give you some examples, if you knew that the power went off and it was not coming back on, right, you might think differently about what you have and what you need to do than if the power went out and you thought, well, the worst case scenario is the food in my refrigerator is going to go bad. Somebody's going to be around before the ice cream melts, and they're going to be, carrying with them all kinds of food and water and supplies, and then everything's going to be fine again. And the worst case scenario, I have to turn in a report to my insurance carrier to get reimbursed for the food that's spoiled, which is what so many people went through here in Western New York. But the truth is, when you follow that book, and again, I don't want to give too much away, but we can talk a little bit about things that make sense, like you might decide that you want to, instead of letting some of that food go bad, take care of it. You might try to purify it, either with salt or with sugar or the many other, just by cooking it, by keeping it cool, things like that. You might decide to protect certain things. You might decide that you're going to put some law enforcement in place to stop people from either looting or things like that. You might even decide, for example, to look at assets that you normally wouldn't, like veterinary facilities that have medicine, homes, places where there are people who need extra attention or help, or where there are things that people might go and take. And so those are the types of things that I think when you go through that process, you think about. But another thing that I think really is drawn out by that book is that there's a lot of the basic preparedness that comes along with the resolve to be ready and the federal government stance, which it's great that I guess they promote any preparedness, but it's kind of anemic when you think about a larger disaster. Because if you have what the recommended 72 hours of food and water, and that's what you have is actually food and water that you can use in an emergency, that's going to go away. And after 72 hours, you don't have anything. But if in addition to having things that you can actually straight out use, you had the ability to purify water, again, whether that's through water filters or some other means, to collect water through, let's say, off your gutters into a rain barrel or things like that, to get more food, whether that's from fishing or hunting, but particularly gardening and things like that. If you had those skills and you had not only seeds put away, a lot of people talk about seeds being put away and having heirloom versus hybrid seeds. But if they don't practice those skills, quite frankly, those things, while important, nothing's as important as the skills. And so you have to actually use them. And you have to, for example, if you are into having seeds, you have to try to plant them and learn how to germinate them and learn how to care for plants. And you'll make mistakes in the process. And you'll also learn about pests. And you'll learn about how to protect your things from pests and maybe animals that you want to keep or have or grow if you're in an area where that can happen. A lot of times, when you talk about this subject, people will say, well, I'm all set because I have a gun. And that means I can hunt, right? And that means worst case, I can defend myself. And worst case scenario, I guess I could. And this is, I think incredibly irresponsible, but I can go take things from other people. So if I have a gun, I have everything. And it's completely ridiculous. And I'll tell you, first of all, that anyone who thinks that they're going to go take stuff from people who are well prepared because they have a gun need to understand that those people usually have a lot of guns. so and you don't want to be wounded in a world with no doctors and electricity either, because a simple scratch can lead to your demise. So you don't want to be in that situation. Secondly, for those people who are out there who are hunters, you need to think about the fact that while you may be a successful hunter, how many of you have had a really successful hunt on the last day of hunting season? Right? I mean, first of all, the deer get skittish, right? And how many deer do you think are out there? Right now, in Western New York anyway, we have a bit of an overpopulation problem, which is why, permits are handed out, but there's only so many permits, and we only take so many, and there are only so many doe permits. How long do you think that's sustainable when nobody has food? Mm-hmm. So fishing's a little bit better than that, depending on where you live. Certainly if you live on a coast. But if you live on the coast, you also have to think about desalinization of water, because you can't, you may not be able to get fresh water as easily. And then again, when you look at, planting food, I mean, that's always a great option. And then there are, people who talk about either keeping chickens or rabbits or things like that, that even if you only had a mating pair or so, you could ramp up in an emergency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Here, we've got a question in the chat room.
Sure.
Ross, do you know what the pinch is that was in Ocean's 11 movie?
I do.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
Someone has asked, does that really exist, or was it just a fantasy of Hollywood?
No, it's a great question. There's actually a film that was produced by Bill Nye the Science Guy. Ironically enough, and it may be a military film even, but it's how Hollywood gets it wrong. And Hollywood.
Be sure you explain to us, especially for my benefit, what the pinch is, because I didn't see this.
Well, the pinch is more like it puts out a fast, intense burst.
Okay.
Of energy. And so from that standpoint, yes, absolutely, you can have something like a pinch device. And if you remember at the top of the show, I was talking about devices that you could, say, have in the back of a pickup truck. And you could take out several blocks, with something like that. The problem where with Hollywood gets it wrong is, if you think back to the story, they set off the pinch device. They then went in and robbed the casino. And then as soon as, the appropriate time in the storyline was, all the power came back on. Mm. And the problem is, when you're dealing with an EMP, whether it's an RF or, I'll just call, a man-made less than nuclear weapon, or whether it's a nuclear weapon, or whether it's a geomagnetic storm, the things that are damaged are not damaged like, go flip the breaker switch on that. They're done. They're toast.
That's exactly right. There's components that are absolutely critical that have just been melted. And
They've
you have to
melted.
Completely replace them. You can't just flip the switch back on. You have to replace them, and most people don't have the odds and ends sitting around or know how to replace them.
Now, back when I talked about the difference between the E1, the E2, and the E3 pulse, and I said the E3 pulse is very similar between the nuclear burst and the Great Geomagnetic Storm. The pinch, or the RF weapons, those types of weapons, are most like the E1 fast pulse of a nuclear weapon. They're not quite as devastating, so there are people who say, well, if you protect against the RF or, the smaller man-made weapons, and you protect against the E3 type of pulse, then you've also protected against nuclear weapons, E1, E2, and E3. And while that's partially true, and certainly you would have, definitely mitigated a great way. I think that if you talk to the experts, most of the experts will say, but there are things that you need to look at for a nuclear burst that go beyond what you'd be looking at for something like an RF weapon or a pinch device.
Yeah. I tell you, one of the things that always occurs to me, first of all, is water. Somebody in the chat room just mentioned that you've got to get water and then food. And how many gallons of water do you count on per person per week or whatever?
Yeah, well, it's a great point. First of all, there's something called the rule of three, right? So you can't go more than 3 minutes without air, which for the most part isn't a problem in the EMP. Although we can talk a little bit about what would happen with nuclear plants if we have time. But then when you look at you can't go more than 3 days without water. You can't go more than 3 weeks without food. And there are ones for shelter and things like that aren't as much a critical factor here. But for the most part, people need at least 1 gallon of water per person per day, and that's not assuming a high level of physical activity, and it's not assuming an intense heat or anything like that. Now, I had mentioned before, I currently live in Western New York, but my wife and I spent some time living in Phoenix, Arizona.
Oh my!
And dry heat or not dry heat, okay? Once you're over 100 degrees, I mean, my oven's a dry heat, okay?
Yeah, it's hot.
My oven's a dry heat. That doesn't mean that I can live there. And I can remember, especially when we first moved out there, just regular day driving, and just being out in the area, getting intense headaches and cramps and, being debilitated. And why? Because I wasn't drinking enough water.
Right.
And then you start to really thirst for water. Somebody says, you want a soda? No, give me a big cup of water. Do you want this? No, water. And I drank water, like a fiend. And in fact, when I came back, to New York, I drank too much water. I could not have done a show for an hour and a half with you.
We won't go
there. I figured, hopefully the subtlety wasn't lost, and I don't think it was. So, the point being, water is hugely important. And it's the thing that everyone would be in trouble with. And, we talked a little earlier about the regular water contamination, but I also want to point out that, if you just think about the things in your area that either because the water couldn't be treated or because of the things which are normally safeguarded against that would no longer be safeguarded against. For example, there are a lot of places, especially here, in Western New York, where you have sites where there are chemicals and things like that, and they have to constantly pump water and pump these chemicals down into these certain wells, or they would contaminate the water. If those pumps aren't available, then that water is going to be further contaminated. You also have to consider the fact that there are going to be problems with sewage and other things like that. And to give you, further on that, if you take L.A., L.A. is, lower than, they pump their sewage up and out of L.A. So it is not just the normal cesspool that you think of. A lot of people when they talk about L.A. And I love L.A. I've been out there a lot, but I'm joking, of course. But it would be a literal cesspool because you couldn't even pump the sewage out of it.
Well,
and if you think about being in a city,
they must do something like that in New Orleans too.
I'm sure. I don't know specifically, but I'm sure they do. But if you think about, let's take a New York City or any city. If you can't pump water up, then anybody who's in a large, a high rise of any kind is going to be in, pretty quick trouble.
Oh, yeah.
And if you can't pump sewage out, then you're going to have problems with that.
One of the points in the book, when you start talking about, unfortunately, all of these people